Hey guys, my name is Ted, but I'm sure you already know that because you've seen my very lovely face on the review column. My face was like, and then whatever my face was like. And if you haven't and you don't know who I am, then shame on you. Go read it right now. It's the best reviews you'll ever read. They're in the comments below. This is my video segment titled, But Then It Was Like, Thoughtful Face. And this is where I talk about things that I found to be worth talking about in the game that weren't really review related, but were more kind of meta concepts. So if you're a meta gamer, really like the idea of, intellectual discussion of games, this is the place for you, and I really hope you enjoy our first episode. The question of what is an indie game is a very kind of hard question to tackle. It's something that I've been trying to tackle for a really long time. Especially because every time you talk to someone about what is an indie game, it seems like everyone has their own opinion, and it's largely based on what they find to be good, or what they find to be bad based on their opinions of indie games. But the kind of Wikipedia definition dictionary that we have right now of indie games is that they are games that do not have major production company money and a small development team. Which is, if you think about it, like a really, really weird way to define something, because, how small is small? Is it 1 people, 2 people? 2D Boy was 2 people. Mojang, the current Minecraft producers, have 27 people. And if you look at, a lot of the bigger companies, something like Angry Birds, they have 300 employees. But how many of those employees are the people producing the game? How many of those people, what exactly makes up a production development company is a different question. It's much harder to define if you're using this kind of style of definition. The other question of how much money is put into it is also a really big problem, because we find games like Braid, where Jonathan Blow put $180,000 into Braid. Now, this budget doesn't begin to rival, the budget of something like World of Warcraft, or, basically any of the Blizzard titles will have a bajillion more dollars put into it than Braid. But when you're imagining an indie game, because a lot of what makes an indie game is this visceral reaction to the idea of like, oh, indie game, or this is what I immediately think. You don't think $180,000 spent. I remember there was actually a lot of criticism for Braid when it first came out, saying, well, it's not an indie title. He spent $180,000. And while it was his own personal funds, most people don't expect that the indie developer, the little guy going against the big guy, has $180,000 to spend. I certainly don't. If I had $180,000, I hope I could make something as good as Braid. So what I find is that people define indie games based on what they want an indie game to be. So if you have a game that's like an 8-bit game, harkens back to something old school, this idea that the old school was the cool school for the cool kids and stuff like that, and all of us new kids just play Madden and Halo and say faggot all the time. You have this idea that, a game like Mega Man 9 and 10 are indie games. Well, that's not true. They're made by Capcom. They had substantially large budgets. They had a lot of advertisement funding. They were distributed on major distribution platforms. Then you have this idea that there's indie game developers that only make indie games. And, like the new game Crater is a really good example of that, because Fat Shark, the company that made Crater, has made 2 other games in the past, and they made Lead and Gold, which is an indie multiplayer shooter, and Hamilton's Big Adventure. And adventure games are interesting because they kind of are eternally indie, even if they're made by, like Telltale Games, which is the biggest adventure game producer. But like adventure games are kind of in this eternally indie spot, which is a very like odd way to look at it, just because they're not mainstream, even though, the Walking Dead games sold a jillion copies and it made a lot of money. So we have this idea of an indie game developer. Well, what does that even mean? Like, if your company is based off having a very few amount of people and then making games for a budget price, are you an indie developer or are you a budget title game creator? That's a much bigger question. And it's one that isn't really answered by the current definition. So you don't take major production company money, okay. Well, you don't really need major production company money to make really small titles. And then, with a lot of the digital distribution we have nowadays, you don't need it. You don't need a major production company to put out a game. If you have, something like Steam or Desura or even the Xbox Live Arcade, you don't need major production company money in order to put out a game. So this kind of antiquated idea that you need production company money to be a mainstream title and no production company money to be an indie title doesn't really work. And I think it doubly doesn't work because people haven't really been using this definition. It's kind of something you can point at and say, this is what an indie game is, this is what we think it is, but realistically, what we think an indie game is what we want an indie game to be, which I think is a big problem. The question is kind of raised, how do we deal with indie games? And I don't mean deal in the sense that, like, what are we going to do about this great indie game menace? No, I don't think indie games are a problem. I think that they're a great thing, and you might not, immediately recognize that based on my review of Lone Survivor, because it wasn't very positive. But I do like indie games. I do support the indie game development of indie games. And I support it because I think it's a good idea to have a competitive marketplace. You need to have these small guys with good individual ideas to kind of combat the wave of mainstream titles that tend to side with safety and sameness, things that are assured to get sales, rather than tackle new ideas. Now, this isn't to say that the mainstream marketplace doesn't have good ideas every now and then, but that you're more likely to get good, not good, but creative, new, experimental, I think experimental is really the best word to use because they could succeed, they could fail, ideas out in the marketplace. However, I don't feel that indie games are in any way threatened by major companies. About 4 years ago, I think, the video game marketplace was very different than it is today. Major titles, major production companies kind of ruled the development of games. They still do. They make a lion's share of the money. But the main thing was that the little guy really couldn't get his games out there. 4 years ago, something miraculous happened. World of Goo came out, made by 2D Boy. Two-person production company made a really kind of interesting physics-based puzzle game. And it sold really well. And what it did was it not only changed what we considered possible for two people to make in small development teams, but it changed how games are distributed. They distributed it through their website. You could pay any amount of money, from a penny to whatever, for the game. And as a result, a lot of people bought it from their website, and a lot of indie game companies or indie game sellers now copy this model. We have these indie bundles that are sold every now and then. The Humble Indie Bundle, Royal Indie Bundle. I know that there's probably a couple that I'm missing, and I'm sure I'll see all your comments below about, oh, you missed my favorite indie bundle, but, oh, well, I'm sorry, I can't keep up with all of them all the time. But we also have distribution services that cater to indie games. So we have Steam, which doesn't necessarily cater to indie games as much as it gives them a method of distribution. And I would say that Steam sales definitely help get indie games out there. We have the Xbox Live Arcade with the indie games section. And I know that there's a lot of criticism for Microsoft for the indie game section, but I don't really want to get into that right now. But it is a way for indie games to get out there. We have companies like Desura, which are a great way if you want to get your beta out there, if you want to get people to get interested in your game, if you need extra funding to get to the completed state. Desura is a wonderful way to do that. I personally use Gamersgate. Because I like the idea that every time I buy a game, I get some coins that I can spend on another game, which I think is just kind of cool. But the whole thing is that indie games no longer are this strange kind of piece of gold we find under a rainbow. They're not like the hidden leprechaun that lives under the stairs. They're not hard to find, and there's, it's not like when you figure out that World of Goo exists, you've just found the closet to Narnia, and you're like, oh shit, I just found the most amazing thing ever. No, the indie games are everywhere now. So there's no longer a compelling interest to be nice to indie games just to let them exist, because indie games can exist now. The question is that you don't want to bash an indie game for having a little budget, because they can't really help that. The amount of money that you have, as much as you can say you can be industrious and raise funds, yeah, well, that's really not entirely true. It's a bit difficult to get funding for a game, especially if the level that, Jonathan Blow had with $180,000 of personal funds. How we should deal with indie games is to not bash them for having a small budget. How do you do that? How do you effectively not bash a game for having a small budget? Well, there's two different sides to this. And the first side is the budgetary concerns, the budgetary forms of design, which is things like graphics. Okay, can we have the highest end physics and graphics in this game? No? Well, okay, we don't have $1 billion to do that with, and we don't have a 300-person development team. Okay. can we have a level of visual fidelity where when Max Payne dives into a wall, he'll like curve off the edge, and then his bullets will like, when he gets shot, the decals will stay, and you know, when someone gets shot, their brains will blow out in exactly the right way. Well, you probably can't do that if you don't have a lot of money to spend on the game, which is totally okay. Things like length are a budgetary concern. I would say things like length are a budgetary concern. Now, of course, you can have a game like Minecraft that literally just goes on forever, but that's a different question. If you're making an RPG or a shooter and you only have $10,000 to put in the game, you can't make the game 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 hours long. So I usually don't knock an indie game for being like only a couple of hours long. Then you have things, on the other hand, that are design questions. One of the design questions would be something like, does this game have visual fidelity? A visual fidelity means, does everything, you know, fit together visually? And Lone Survivor is like a really good example of a game with no visual fidelity. You know, you're trying to create this creepy horror atmosphere, but you can't read anything. And it's a text-based game. There's no voice acting. So if I can't read things and I have to read things, then there's some kind of disconnect there. Things like, is the combat good? You know, when I shoot guns, do the enemies get hit by my bullets, and do I like the way that feels? That's something that you don't really need a budget to work in. You just need a good design team. Things like story. If your story sucks, well, then you're a shitty writer. Sorry. No amount of money was going to make you a good writer. Maybe you could hire another writer, but then it would increase the development team, and then you wouldn't be an indie game, I guess. I don't know. It's not... But I would say that things like writing and plot are all things that, if you just had better ideas, then the game would be better. And I'm not gonna say that a game should be excused its bad ideas just because it's an indie game. I mean, everyone has bad ideas. It doesn't matter if you're an indie game or not. We shouldn't say that, well, just because you didn't have any money, your ideas can suck. I know that I've been over a lot of stuff today about, you know, what makes an indie game and, you know, what indie games mean to us now. So I guess the big question is, what does this all mean? You know, what does all of this that I'm saying mean? And I think that it's important for us as intellectuals or discussers of games, you know, people that are trying to really take the medium seriously, to have a kind of standard of communication when it comes to things like indie titles. So we have games with a lower budget, and that's just a fact, is that some games have lower budgets than other games. But what we need to do is we need to figure out kind of what constitutes a lower budget. Is $180,000 from Jonathan Blow's personal bank account enough to make a game not an indie title? Is having a 27-person development team or a 17-person development team or an 8-person development team enough to make a game be able to be judged differently? Should we not have the indie game classification at all? Should we put things in this box of indie as kind of an excuse for why they have a lower production value? And so that's kind of the question I wanted to raise for you today. What is the point of the indie classification? What kind of purpose can it serve? My personal take on this is that there are certain things that an indie title should have leeway for, like I mentioned before, when you have the budgetary constraints. I mean, Lone Survivor is a really good example of something that just had design flaws, even though it was a low-budget title. You know, it had a hunger system that didn't really work. It had really bad personification of characters. It had a really terrible repercussion system where, you know, you get negative evil points for eating red pills. That doesn't make any sense to me, other than that red is angry color. That's kind of my opinion, is that there's certain things that you have to accept that a low-budget game will have. And I guess indie just sounds better than low-budget game. And a lot of people will want to say it's an indie title, or, you know, it's a small team title rather than it's a budget title. It just doesn't sound good to say budget title. You think of, you know, kind of something you'd find in the bottom of a bargain bin. So my question to you is, how should we deal with the indie game title? You know, are there things that we should grant bigger leeway to? Are there things that we should judge harsher even? Should we even have an indie game classification at all? Or should we just judge games on a case-by-case basis? I know that, you know, everyone would like to say everything is its own special snowflake and we have to deal with it, you know, individually. But I mean, there's a reason for classification. There's a reason we call things horror games. There's a reason we call things shooters. Is there a purpose to indie games? And I really am looking forward to hearing your comments in the comments section of YouTube, and I really hope that you take the time to reply and give me your thoughts too. Anyways, I really hope that you've enjoyed my first video of But Then It Was Like... thoughtful face. And I hope you tune in next week for the next episode, which will probably be on... I don't know.